Welcome to This is What Democracy Sounds Like. I'm Kevin Prang. This program is a presentation of Metropolitan Congregations United. MCU is a community organization that brings together religious congregations, community groups, and individuals to work for a common purpose to create a better life for all residents of the region. Today, our guest is Emmaline Giles. Emmaline is the environmental justice organizer for MCU, and today we're going to be talking about environmental justice, how that impacts the St. Louis area, and what MCU and local congregations can do. Emmaline, how are you doing? Are you staying safe?
Yes, I'm doing well and fortunately staying safe. This is a weird time for all of us, but I'm really fortunate and privileged to be doing the work that I'm doing.
Great. How is kind of this staying separate affected, being in a social justice organization that sort of depends on connections? What are you doing to stay connected?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I think it also goes into how I'm a new organizer in the organization as well. So it's a lot of learning and it's been a lot of transitioning into first understanding, how does MCU do their organizing and how am I going to be doing it in my own way, but also how am I now going to be doing that digitally? What does digital organizing look like? So meanwhile, of course, all of us are dealing with the emotional impacts of what's going on today. So it's been interesting, but I think I feel very fortunate that a lot of the conversations I've been having and the feedback I've been getting it seems like it hasn't really been negative in terms of, the pandemic and the concerns over it. It's actually increased, I think, the amount of connection, though the conversations are a little different but it's, I think, helped because a lot of my phone calls are really just checking in on people and seeing how they're doing and trying to connect people to resources. And, because this is so relational, I think this is a time in social distancing that we all are needing to connect, whether it's over Zoom or phone calls or whatever it is. We instinctually are, by nature, social beings. So I haven't really seen a detriment in that area.
Okay, good. So let's talk about what you're here for, environmental justice. It's kind of a new term for some people. What does it encompass? And obviously this is more than just recycling cans here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, to me, essentially, environmental justice, or EJ for short, is really a movement, and it's led by people of color. And it really demands that environmental racism be dismantled, that all people have the opportunity to live a safe and healthy life. And the voices that of the most oppressed are heard and equitably addressed by decision makers. I think, in the word itself, environmental, and the two words in the phrase, that EJ is different from environmentalism. I think that's very important. I think for many, many decades, environmentalism has been known more mainstream, and it doesn't really encapsulate the justice part of environmental justice, right? It's justice is the piece of that it's led by people of color who are most impacted, and it also addresses all other forms of injustices like racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc. So I think environmental justice is very unique. And what is vital about it is that, if you think about it, the environment is all around us. It's everywhere we look, what we breathe, how we eat, or what we eat, how we interact with our world. But it's not all equitable, of course. Everything we do has an impact on our environment, whether it's immediately in our local community or global, although the way in which the environment is impacted is more often unsustainable and inequitable.
So it gives sort of the idea that the way we interact with the environment is different depending on who you are, where you live, and what other forms of oppression are sort of in place. Can you expand on that a little bit more and maybe give some examples?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, EJ is an umbrella term to me, and it encapsulates anything from food access, food injustice, to energy injustice. So, um, the right energy injustice, for example, is the right to an equitable access of heating in the winter months, or the right to clean tap water from lead toxicity. A nationally known example of that is Flint, Michigan. So I think it really has to do with like you said, the oppressions layered on top of that, depending on what community you're living in. It's geographical. If you're living in a community that is in the county of St. Louis, you have a different property value, you have different resources in your schools, and you're probably not going to have a refinery by you. Or a landfill next to you. And those are all examples of environmental justice issues.
Are there any other specific St. Louis issues that you've seen since you've been on board here?
Yeah, there are many, but some examples in St. Louis span across the board, and anything from we have I still think it's interesting that many people are not aware of this, but in the county, there's actually a nuclear waste site at the Westlake landfill. And that nuclear waste has been seeping into the groundwater and then into the Missouri River for decades as it sits in the floodplains. So this, of course, has directly impacted adjacent communities, even down the river. And then another example I could share is, of course, a lot of folks know there are high rates of asthma, especially in certain communities, right? Because we have rampant air pollution. And that's due to many different reasons. Of course, St. Louis and the state of Missouri is as a coal burning industry state. So that in and of itself causes a lot of air pollution. But there's a particular example that is, a big issue currently. In South City, there's a landfill along the Mississippi River, which is now starting to burn pelletized trash to produce energy. But at the same time as burning this, it's releasing toxins in the air, which is directly impacting the communities adjacent to that landfill.
Can you talk about how the environment or the injustice in the environment becomes sort of a multiplier when combined with other injustices? So one of the things that pops to my head is education, and lead poisoning and education just sort of compounds everything. Are there any other examples like that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I think that is actually a really good example. I think if you want to go into that too, because it leads to many other things. But we're talking about lead poisoning that exists within a lot of our buildings are older. We have a lot of lead still exists in a lot of our paint, and children who have access to that. Of course, if people, I'm sure, very much know that. Kids like to eat sweet things, and lead in paint tends to be sweet, and then ingesting lead at any level. I think before, back in the day, we considered certain levels to be safe. That's not the consensus nowadays. It's no level is safe for consumption, and it really impacts the neurological development of children. So that goes into the education piece that you're bringing up, right? We also have lead toxicity in schools that's not really being grappled with, I think, to the degree it should be. For example, there are old pipings for water fountains in certain schools, old infrastructure going back to like energy efficiency, right? Old infrastructure piping that actually seeps lead into drinking water. So that's another example. And I think what really is poignant is that there is actually an environmental racism report that was released last fall for the city of St. Louis, and It's stated specifically that Black St. Louisans are disproportionately harmed by lead poisoning, like we're speaking of, asthma, mold, and high energy costs. And we can go into, for example, mold. When we're talking about other social justice issues, let's talk about housing justice issues, where we have a huge issue in St. Louis of slumlords, and not addressing mold issues, and which, you know, your landlords are responsible for if you're a renter. And that mold is impacting asthma, it's impacting allergies, health, long term. So that's coupled with other environmental justice issues, of course, as well. And we're talking about substandard housing conditions. So those are just some other examples.
And I guess the way it sort of compounds too is then if you're a child and you're sick because of asthma or other health issues, you're not getting to school, you're not having those days in school, or studying becomes more difficult. And it just sort of layers on top of what's already pressing down on that child and that family. And it almost becomes impossible to escape out from under it then.
Exactly. And then you can add in, so like I said, you know, environmental justice is a lot of things. So add on top of that, food insecurity, access to food. Maybe you have a corner market, but how expensive if there is any fresh produce, how expensive is that? Talking about access, and not to mention culturally relevant food, you know, and is there knowledge around how to cook that food, or the tools to cook that food if you do have access to that food? And that goes into the economic poverty, you know, issues. So yeah, you could keep layering that.
So you talked about the food insecurity, and right now with schools closed, that's at least one meal a day that kids were getting through
Yeah.
school. Are there any other ways that our current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic sort of relates to this, or is this sort of the big one that it's compounding that food insecurity right now?
Oh, so many ways. Yeah, no, the food is definitely a big issue. I mean, just last week, I believe the St. Louis public school system was also delivering meals, and two of their bus drivers passed because of COVID. So they put on hold all of their meal delivery services, and I think what I'm learning is that meals is the biggest need in the moment, in addition to testing sites, especially in North County. Like at this point, I think there might be 3, but it's taken how many weeks to get at least 3 in North County? So talking about, you know, inadequate health services and access to that, Black St. Louisans are, you know, the least resourced in those areas. And it's going back into that compounded issues that we're talking about. It's very much related to environmental justice.
Okay. So MCU has been engaged or hasn't been engaged in environmental issues specifically in the past. Why has this become important now for MCU?
Yeah, well, I think I would actually say MCU has been engaged with environmental justice issues in the past. However, it just didn't have the name of environmental justice issues, you know, like we were talking about before. You know, it's not a clear line. I mean, when we're talking about housing issues, there are essentially environmental justice issues in housing when you're talking about adequate housing without that's habitable, you know, that's healthy, there's no mold, there's no pests, things of that nature. So I definitely think that MCU has been engaging in that way, though the term environmental justice is definitely becoming more acknowledged and understood in this bigger social justice work. I think that, you know, other cities around the US also are, you know, using environmental justice as well, and understanding how important it is to be talking about it, because it's all connected. And so I think St. Louis as a region is organizations and organizers like MCU are starting to catch on and really understand the importance of using that. I also want to add, as I mentioned earlier, there is the environmental racism report. I think that was a huge catalyst in bringing more of this conversation to the forefront. It wasn't not the first of the many reports that St. Louis has conducted and published, but I think it was a complement to like the equity indicators report, for example, and the reports before that. This has a strictly environmental racism lens, though, building upon all of those other equity issues. And so I think from there, I want to also add that MCU, I think, is also coming to the forefront in this work because last fall also there was a Green the Church conference. And that conference brought together many different partners and clergy leaders from around the region to have this discussion, to talk about what does it mean to talk about environmental justice and what is the role of congregations in this work. And I think that was a big catalyst as well.
Okay. So who is MCU reaching out to specifically? What's kind of the plan for outreach?
Yeah, so currently we're focusing on working with people of color, clergy leaders, of course. As I mentioned, the definition, to me around environmental justice is really led by people of color who are impacted the most by environmental racism. And because of the context of St. Louis, those communities are specifically, structured by design in North St. Louis most of the time. And so working with clergy leaders in North St. Louis, really to build a base of local congregation leaders. So I'm right now working on building relationships, in the context of COVID-19 too, and really trying to stimulate faith-based dialogue really around the impacts of environmental racism, with the hopes of spearheading a local environmental justice movement, honestly.
Usually, I mean, religious leaders aren't traditionally thought of as a venue for environmental issues. That's sort of been something in our society that's sort of been a part. Are you finding you're having different conversations because you're reaching first to ministers and trying to get their congregations involved? Which, do they see it as, yes, we need to be involved in this, or is it an education process for those folks?
Yeah, good question. It's definitely an education process. And I think it's an education process for the whole region. I have definitely some context because, I worked in the Bay Area, for example, for a while around environmental justice. It was the first time I learned of that, and people were already working in that. Coming here to St. Louis, it's not a term that people are using, more now so, but it's definitely an education process because what we've known around environmental issues has been environmentalism, which really has been a white-led kind of academic or not just academic, but like movement in that sense that doesn't capture justice issues, that is not led by people of color, that does not consider environmental issues to be mold in your house, for example, or food injustice, or lead toxicity in your soil. And this environmental justice provides that different lens to really see that when we're talking about environment, all of it is environment. Our living environment, our lived experiences, not just going out to the river and the forest. That's not the only environment that exists.
Yeah, it seems like we're trying to take the conversation from environmentalism is this big picture, global, like you said, the forests and oceans, and it's big.
And conservation.
Right. And bring it down to, how is this affecting you in your daily life? That seems to be where the education is sort of taking place, is look around you and see what you're seeing in your daily life and how it's affecting you.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
And it also sounds like we're sort of moving the conversation from, I think a lot of the racism, the oppression, the poverty forces people to survive. And what environmental justice is looking for that position where people thrive and not just survive, where
Exactly.
it's more than just getting by. It's about being that whole and healthy person.
Yeah, definitely.
How does, to take it back out, are we seeing impacts of climate change in our very specific local communities?
Yeah, I would definitely say so, just in terms of, in the summers, how our summer heats and how long our summers are lasting, for example, or in the winters, the changes in our temperatures, extremes, and all of that. It's, Missouri is also a farming state, so how that impacts our own like local food supply is definitely impacted. But on the local level, how that impacts the seasonal allergies. That's one big thing, that how long that season lasts and how that exacerbates people who have asthma already in the communities that we're talking about. And then we're exacerbating that because they don't have resources to adequate health services. It's all connected in that sense.
Okay. So what are some of the specific issues that MCU wants to tackle in the weeks and months ahead?
Yeah, so we were just talking about how, environmental justice it means many things, and it can be complicated, and then there's an education process. And I think, at least in my experience too, it's definitely, it can do a lot of things. It can take hope away if you're coming at people and saying, look at all of the environmental injustices you're dealing with. It's overwhelming if this hasn't been a conversation before, where you're trying to survive, like you're saying, right? I'm just trying to get food on the table daily. How am I going to even be talking or thinking about, the air pollution? I have no control, or all of these things, right? So it's really trying to start the conversation and meeting folks where they're at, and it being accessible. So one of the ways we've strategized and how it's also been done elsewhere effectively is really starting the conversation around energy efficiency. You know, a big thread throughout a lot of this work is the people who are most impacted are struggling the most with poverty and just trying to get by. And so through energy efficiency initiatives or little projects, whether it's in your congregation or in your homes, can really help at the end of the day or at the end of the year through your annual utility bills. And as I was mentioning before, we're talking about a lot of these communities have really old infrastructure. Um, you know, they are having maybe old, inadequate heating and cooling systems or light fixtures, maybe no insulation sometimes. So a lot of heat in the winter is lost, and you're paying and using twice as much energy that you shouldn't have to be. And there are statistics that really show that our low-income households actually do pay more for energy than average households because of all of these issues. And that includes our congregations. A lot of times their buildings are and their systems are old and inefficient, and they need repairs. And it typically results in a lot of these congregations and households paying more than others for using the same amount of electricity, for example. So, and then going back to, climate change, we were talking about the impacts on that. With the increasing variability of our weather extremes, we're also seeing residents burdened by higher energy costs because of that. With, like I said, the longer summers, the longer winters, we're having many times people are choosing between paying rent or food on the table as opposed to paying their heating bill. And I personally know many people who are having to go without their heating bill during the winter.
Okay, excellent. And real quickly, if a congregation wants to get more involved, if they want to learn more, or they're ready to get active, what can they do?
Yeah, I would say my first recommendation is definitely access that. It's a free, accessible, the Environmental Racism Report that was released last fall. I think that is definitely a good resource to understanding the context and the specific issues that we're dealing with in the region. And then I would also recommend looking into the Green the Church conference, YouTube recorded panel discussions. I think that those are really helpful conversations to learn. And then to get active, please reach out to me if you definitely want to learn more, have this conversation with me, get to know one another, and how we could work together potentially. And I also know many other organizers and people doing this work in the region. So if I'm not the first person that can directly help you, I definitely have a lot of other information and connections that we can work with. But definitely working, like I said, with building a base and eventually building up some action. So if you stay in contact with me, there's going to be many opportunities to plug in.
All right, great. Emmaline, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Emmaline Giles is the environmental justice organizer at MCU. To learn more about MCU, go to Metropolitan Congregations United website at mcustlewis.org. We'll have more information so you can learn more about environmental justice there. Also be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other outlets for news and events. If you want to participate with us, please join us at one of these events, and you can find details on our website and social media outlets. I'm Kevin Prang, and you have been listening to This Is What Democracy Sounds Like. Tune in again next time, and we thank you for listening.